The knock was not a knock at all, but the thud of a body hitting the packed earth by her well. Ilara knew the sound. She had heard it at Antietam and again at Gettysburg, the sound of a man's strength giving out all at once. She was 42, a widow for 10 years, and had lived alone in this high meadow cabin for 6. Her hands, which had once held a surgeon's instruments, were now accustomed to the axe handle and the hoe. She had come west to forget the sounds men make when they are dying, but the world had a long memory. She set down the pestle, the scent of crushed yarrow clinging to her fingers, and pushed open the heavy plank door. Dusk was settling, bleeding purple and rose into the sharp edges of the pines. A horse, reins trailing in the dust, stood with its head low, sides heaving. And at the base of the stone-lined well lay a man, face down, a dark stain spreading across the back of his canvas coat like a terrible bloom. She moved with an economy born of long practice. There was no fear, only a familiar cold assessment. First, the horse. It was a good animal, just run hard. She tethered it to the hitching post, her eyes scanning the tree line. No one followed. Then, the man. She knelt, her knees sinking into the cool dirt. Her fingers went to his neck, finding the faint, thready pulse. Alive. That was the first hurdle. She rolled him over. His face was pale under a layer of grime and stubble, lips tinged blue. His eyes were closed, his breathing a shallow rasp. She saw the entry wound then, a ragged hole high on his left shoulder, near the collarbone. But it was the exit that was the problem. The stain on his back told her the bullet had torn through, taking God knew what with it. He was a big man, heavy with muscle, and dragging him would be a trial. But leaving him here was a death sentence. She hooked her arms under his, planting her feet. The dead weight was immense, a reminder of how small she was, how isolated. She pulled, her boots slipping, her breath coming in sharp bursts. He groaned, a low, animal sound of pure pain, and for a moment his eyes fluttered open. They were a startling, clear gray, and they fixed on her face with a brief, desperate lucidity before clouding over again. He was trying to say something, but only a bloody froth appeared at the corner of his mouth. "Hush now," she said, her voice rough from disuse. "Save your strength for breathing." She pulled again, dragging him inch by painful inch across the yard, leaving a dark trail in the dust. The cabin door was low and wide. She maneuvered him through it, the scent of his blood, metallic and sharp, filling her small home. She laid him on the bearskin rug before the cold hearth, the only space large enough. For a moment, she stood over him, her hands on her hips, taking in the ruin of him. The worn leather of his gun belt, the good quality of his boots, the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes. Another soldier from a different war, washed up on her shore. She lit the lantern, the flame chasing the shadows into the corners, and went to boil water. The work was about to begin. She did not allow herself to think of who he was or why he had come to her door bleeding. Such questions were a luxury for later, for a time when death was not a guest sitting at her table. For now he was only a body, a collection of torn flesh and failing systems that she might, with skill and luck, coax back into the business of living. Her cabin was a place of solitude, not sanctuary, but for him, tonight, it would have to be both. She took a long, steadying breath. The quiet of the mountains pressed in, a silence that was usually a comfort, but now felt like a judgment. It was just her, the dying man, and the ghosts of all the others she had tried to save. She picked up the shears. The cloth of his coat was thick, stiff with dried blood. It would have to be cut away. She knelt beside him again, the lantern light casting their twinned shadows, long and distorted, against the log walls. Her hands were steady. They had to be. It was all she had left. The shears made a rasping sound as they bit into the heavy wool of his coat. She worked methodically, cutting up the seam from the hem to the collar, peeling the garment away from his skin. Underneath, his cotton shirt was a ruin, soaked through with a dark, almost black wetness that told her the bleeding had been going on for some time. She cut that away too, the scissors cold against his skin. He didn't flinch. He was either unconscious or possessed of a formidable will. She suspected the latter. The wound was worse than she'd first thought. The bullet had entered cleanly from the front, a small, neat hole. But where it had exited, it had shattered the back of his shoulder, tearing a ragged, star-shaped crater in the flesh. Bone fragments glinted in the lantern light. It was a miracle the ball had missed his lung. She pressed gently around the edges of the wound, her fingers assessing the damage. The flesh was already hot to the touch, the first sign of the fever that would surely come. He needed it cleaned, debrided, and stitched, and he needed it now. She moved between the hearth and the man's side, her motions fluid and certain. She set a kettle of water directly in the flames to boil, the steam soon hissing into the quiet room. In a small wooden chest, her husband's old surgical kit lay nestled in worn velvet. She took out a probe, forceps, and a long, curved needle, laying them on a clean linen cloth. She dropped them into a basin and poured the boiling water over them, the metal clicking softly as it settled. The smell of steam and sterilization filled the cabin, a scent so familiar it was almost comforting. Next came the whiskey, not for drinking, but for cleaning. It was the harshest and most reliable thing she had. She uncorked the bottle, the sharp, oaky smell cutting through the air. He stirred on the floor as she knelt beside him again, his gray eyes opening, no longer clouded, but sharp with pain and awareness. He watched her, his gaze tracking her every movement as she soaked a strip of linen in the raw spirit. He did not speak. He simply watched, his jaw tight. She knew this moment. It was the fulcrum on which a life balanced, the trust a wounded man had to place in the stranger leaning over him. He was taking her measure, she knew. He was seeing the gray streaks in her brown hair, tied back in a severe knot. He was seeing the fine lines around her eyes, the calluses on her hands, the plainness of her worn dress. He was seeing that she was alone, that there was no man's presence in this cabin, no sign of a husband or a father. And she, in turn, was seeing him. The old, faded scars that mapped his torso, a long, silvery line from a knife fight, the puckered divots of old bullets. This was not the first time he had been torn open. She saw the strength in his arms, the corded muscles of his neck, the way he held himself absolutely still, even as a tremor of pain ran through him. He was a man accustomed to violence, both given and received. "This will burn," she said. Her voice was flat, a simple statement of fact. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. His eyes never left her face. She pressed the whiskey-soaked cloth into the wound. His whole body went rigid. A sharp hiss of breath escaped through his clenched teeth, but he made no other sound. He did not cry out, did not pull away. His knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the bearskin rug. His gaze remained locked on hers, fierce and unwavering, as if he could master the pain by staring it down in her eyes. She worked quickly, cleaning the torn flesh, her touch firm but as gentle as she could manage. The whiskey stung, but it would kill the filth from the bullet. She used the forceps to pick out splinters of lead, fragments of cloth, and tiny shards of bone, dropping them with a metallic click into a small bowl. The world shrank to the space of the wound, to the circle of lantern light, to his ragged breathing and the steady beat of her own heart. There was an intimacy in it, this work. To have your hands inside another person's body, to hold their life in your careful fingers, was to know them in a way words never could. He was a stranger, and yet she knew the rhythm of his pain, the texture of his blood, the terrible fragility of his flesh, and he, in his stillness, was giving her a profound, unspoken trust. He was letting her. In the vast, lonely wilderness, this silent contract felt as binding as any vow. She threaded the curved needle with a length of boiled silk thread. The needle felt like an extension of her own fingers, a familiar weight. "I have to close it," she said, her voice still low and even. "The deeper muscle first." He nodded again, a bead of sweat tracing a path from his temple into his beard-stubbled jaw. He watched the needle in her hand, his eyes following its path as she brought it to his skin. The first stitch was always the hardest. The needle dipped, catching the edge of the torn muscle. His breath hitched. She pulled the thread through, her motions economical, precise. Stitch, pull, knot. Stitch, pull, knot, over and over. The room was silent but for the tiny, wet sound of the needle passing through flesh and the rasp of his breathing. He had not looked away from her face, not once. His eyes were a challenge, a question, a plea. She met his gaze, her own expression unreadable. She was a healer. This was her work. It did not matter who he was, but as she leaned closer, her hair brushing his cheek, she could feel the heat radiating from his skin, smell the salt of his sweat. And she knew that this time, it was different. This time, the silence between them was not empty. It was filled with the weight of all the things they were not saying. He broke the silence first. His voice was a dry rasp, forced from a throat tight with pain. "What's your name?" The question hung in the air, stark against the quiet hum of the night. She didn't look up from her work, her focus entirely on the delicate task of drawing the ragged edges of his flesh together. The needle dipped and rose in a steady, rhythmic motion. "Ilara," she said, her own voice low. It felt strange to speak her name aloud, to a stranger after so long. It felt like giving a piece of herself away. She snipped the thread with a small pair of scissors and began a new line of stitches, closing the outer layer of skin. He was quiet for a long moment, his breathing evening out slightly, as if the simple act of speaking had given him a new anchor against the pain. "Silas," he offered. Just the one name. No more. She didn't ask for more. In her experience, men in his condition often had reasons for offering only a single name. She continued her work, her hands moving with the unthinking competence that came from mending hundreds of broken bodies. The lantern light glinted off the needle. His eyes were still on her, and she could feel his gaze as a physical pressure. "Your hands," he said, the words slightly slurred. "They don't shake." It wasn't a question, but an observation, one weighted with a kind of wonder. She glanced at her hands then, seeing them as he must, chapped from lye soap and splintered wood, knuckles swollen slightly with age, but steady as stone. "They've had practice," she replied, her tone clipped. She preferred the silence. Words were complications. They built bridges she had no interest in crossing. But he persisted, his voice a low murmur. "The war?" It was a direct hit. a question that sliced through her careful defenses. She paused, the needle held mid-air. The memories were always there, just beneath the surface. The endless rows of cuts, the stench of gangrene, the screams that faded into whimpers. "Yes," she said, and the single word was heavy with all she would not say. She resumed her stitching, her movements a fraction faster now. He seemed to understand he had touched a nerve and fell silent again. He watched her finish the last stitch, her fingers tying the final knot with a deft twist. The wound was closed, a neat, dark line against the inflamed skin. She cleaned the area one last time and began to prepare a poultice of yarrow and comfrey to draw out the fever and ward off infection. He tracked her every move, his gray eyes shadowed with pain but sharp with intelligence. He was taking in the details of her cabin, the sparse, handmade furniture, the shelf of carefully labeled jars filled with dried herbs, the worn Bible on the mantelpiece, the rifle resting on pegs above the door. He was cataloging her life, trying to piece together the woman who had just saved his. She worked without looking at him, but she felt his scrutiny. It was different from the gazes of the doctors she had worked for, who saw only a pair of hands. It was different from the desperate glances of dying boys. This man, Silas, was looking at her. He saw the ringless finger on her left hand. He saw the resolute set of her jaw, and she knew it. The knowledge was a strange, unsettling warmth in the pit of her stomach. She finished packing the wound and began to wrap it with clean linen bandages, her touch professional and distant once more. The procedure was almost over. The strange intimacy of the medical encounter was drawing to a close, and a new, more complicated silence was settling between them. She wrapped the final bandage, securing it tightly. The wound was closed. The immediate danger, the bleeding, was over. Now came the long battle against fever and infection. She rose, her knees cracking in protest. "I don't have money to pay you," he said, his voice flat. It was the statement of a man used to settling his debts, and the admission cost him something. She looked down at him, at his pale, sweat-sheened face. For the first time, she allowed a flicker of something other than professional detachment to cross her features. "I didn't ask," she replied. The words were simple, but they landed in the quiet room with the force of a covenant. She had not asked for payment, and he had not asked for help. They were two strangers caught in a circumstance, and for now, that was enough. The tension of the procedure eased, replaced by the heavy quiet of aftermath. He had survived the needle and the whiskey. Now he had to survive the night. The work was done, the wound closed and bound. She stood and stretched, the muscles in her back screaming from the long hours spent hunched over him. The air in the cabin was thick with the smells of blood, whiskey, and herbs. It was the smell of her past, a perfume she had traveled 1,000 miles to escape. She looked down at Silas. His eyes were closed again, his face drawn and pale, but his breathing was deeper, more regular. The crisis had passed for now. He was alive, and she had made him so. She gave him a small measure of laudanum mixed with water, lifting his head gently so he could drink. He swallowed with difficulty, his gaze briefly meeting hers, a flicker of gratitude in their depths before the opiate began to drag him under. "Rest," she told him, the command softened by a weariness that went bone deep. "Don't try to move. The stitches are new." He gave a slight nod, his body finally relaxing into the bearskin rug as the drug took hold. He was at her mercy, a fact that sat uneasily between them. For the rest of the night she became a silent guardian. She did not sleep. She pulled a low stool near the hearth and sat, watching him. The fire she'd built up earlier now burned down to glowing embers, casting a warm, flickering light on his face. In sleep, the harsh lines of pain softened, and he looked younger, more vulnerable. She saw the way his dark hair curled at the nape of his neck, the thick line of his lashes against his pale skin. These were details a nurse had no business noticing. But in the profound silence of the mountain night, the line between healer and woman began to blur. She tended the fire, adding a log now and then to keep the chill at bay. She fetched a damp cloth and wiped the sweat from his brow as the fever began to rise, just as she knew it would. His skin was hot and dry to the touch. He mumbled in his delirium, fragments of words she couldn't piece together. A name, a place, a curse. She listened without judgment. The fever stripped a man of his pretenses, laying his soul bare. She brewed a thin broth from dried meat and wild onions, the savory smell filling the small cabin. He would need sustenance when he woke, something easy for his body to take. As she stirred the pot, she thought about the risk she had taken. He could be anyone, a thief, a killer, a man with a price on his head. Bringing him into her home was a foolish act for a woman alone. Her solitude was her shield, and she had just lowered it for a complete stranger. Yet, she felt no regret. When she had seen him lying by her well, there had been no choice to make. You did not leave a man to die if you had the skill to save him. It was the one creed she had carried with her from the war, the only piece of her old life she hadn't buried. Late in the night, he thrashed, his good arm flailing, his legs kicking weakly. The fever had him in its grip. She went to him, speaking in a low, soothing voice, the same tone she had used for frightened horses and delirious soldiers. "Easy now. You're safe. Just rest." She laid a hand on his uninjured shoulder, a firm, grounding pressure. Under her touch, he stilled. He turned his head toward her, his eyes fluttering open. They were unfocused, glazed with fever, but they found her in the dim light. He seemed to recognize her not as a person, but as a presence, a source of comfort. He settled back into a restless sleep, his breathing still labored, but less frantic. She did not remove her hand. For a long while, she simply knelt there, a quiet anchor in his fevered storm. The first hints of dawn were graying the single window, when he finally fell into a deep, healing sleep. She rose stiffly and added another log to the fire, the quiet intimacy of the night settling around her like a shawl. She had kept him alive. Now she had to wonder what she would do with him. 2 days passed in a slow rhythm of care and recovery. The fever broke on the second night, leaving him weak and drenched in sweat, but lucid. He slept for most of the day, waking only for the broth and water she offered. He took them without complaint, his eyes following her as she moved about the small cabin. He was a quiet patient, watchful and accepting of her authority. On the third morning, he was strong enough to sit up, propped against a rolled-up blanket she placed behind his back. The color was returning to his face, and the sharp intelligence was back in his eyes. The fire crackled in the hearth, a comfortable sound against the morning chill. She handed him a tin cup of chicory coffee, her fingers brushing his as he took it. The brief contact sent a strange jolt through her. It was the first time they had touched without the clinical necessity of her work. "You were a nurse," he said. It was a statement, not a question. "At Gettysburg." She looked at him, surprised by his certainty. "How did you know?" she asked, her voice quiet. He took a slow sip of the coffee, his gaze fixed on the fire. "The way you work. Fast, no wasted motion, You don't flinch. And you know a ball wound. Only field surgeons and their best nurses work like that. He paused, his expression turning somber. I was there too. 20th Maine, Little Round Top. The words fell into the quiet room, forging an unexpected, unwelcome bond between them. Gettysburg. A name that was a wound in itself. She had spent a decade trying to forget the sight of that field, the sound of the cannons, the smell of so much death. My husband was a doctor there, she said, the admission tasting like rust in her mouth. He died in the field hospital. Typhus. She hadn't spoken of him in years. The words felt foreign, unearthed from a deep, locked place. I'm sorry, Silas said, and the simple sentiment felt genuine. He looked at her, his gray eyes holding a new understanding. What brought you so far west? She shrugged, turning to stir the pot of stew hanging over the fire. The quiet, she said. I had my fill of people. It was the truest thing she could say. She had come to these mountains seeking an absence, a silence so profound it might finally drown out the ghosts. And you? She asked, turning the question back on him. What argument leaves a man bleeding by a stranger's well? He looked down at his hands, wrapped around the warm cup. I work for a man named Corbin. Owns the big ranch down in the valley, the Sea Bar. Or thinks he does. We were tracking some rustlers who'd run off with a few head of his prize cattle. We cornered them up in the pass. It seems they disagreed with Mr. Corbin's assessment of ownership. He offered a wry, humorless smile. There were 4 of them. I got 2. The other 2 got my partner and this. He gestured to his bandaged shoulder. My horse bolted. I just rode till he stopped. He looked around the cabin, then back at her. Seems he knew where to go. His story was clean, simple, a ranch hand doing his job. But she sensed a hollowness in it, a space where the whole truth should be. He had told her what had happened, but not why. Not really. She ladled stew into a bowl for him, the silence stretching between them once more, now filled with the shared specter of a war and the unasked questions of the present. He ate the stew slowly, deliberately, as if husbanding his strength. He was watching her again with that same unnerving intensity, but now his gaze held something more than just observation. There was a question in his eyes, a weighing of facts. When he finished, he set the bowl aside. This claim, he began, his voice casual, but she heard the careful intention behind it. This cabin, it's good land, good water. She nodded, wary. It's enough, she said. The railroad sold it to me. I have the deed. He was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting to the window, toward the expanse of meadow and timber that was hers. Corbin doesn't recognize the railroad's claims, he said, his voice low, almost reluctant. He says this whole valley was his grazeland, long before the tracks came through. Says the government gave him title. A cold knot formed in her stomach. She knew of Corbin, of course. Everyone in this part of the territory did. He was a man who took what he wanted, a man whose power stretched for miles, casting a long shadow. She had hoped her small, remote parcel was too insignificant to draw his notice. That's a matter for the land office, not for me, she said, her voice sharper than she intended. My title is legal. Silas looked away from the window and met her eyes. The reluctance in his expression was gone, replaced by a deep, weary resignation. He looked like a man about to deliver a verdict he had no wish to pronounce. That's why I was riding up here, Ilara, he said softly, using her name for the first time since the night she'd stitched him together. The sound of it on his lips was both intimate and alarming. That business with the rustlers, it happened on the way, but it wasn't my destination. The cold knot in her stomach tightened into a fist of ice. She stood very still, her hands clenched at her sides. She knew, with a sudden, sickening certainty, what he was about to say. "Corbin sent me," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "He heard a squatter had built a cabin on the creek. He sent me to persuade you to leave." The confession landed in the quiet cabin with the force of a physical blow. Persuade. She knew what that word meant in Corbin's vocabulary. It meant threats. It meant fear. It meant burning a cabin to the ground if necessary. The man she had saved, the man whose life she had held in her hands, had come to destroy hers. The irony was so bitter it almost made her laugh. She felt a flush of hot, furious anger rise in her chest. All the nascent trust, the fragile connection forged in pain and silence, shattered. "Get out," she said, her voice a low, trembling whisper. "Out?" He looked at her, his face a mask of disbelief. "Ilara, I can barely stand." "I don't care," she spat, her voice gaining strength. "I saved your life. I didn't save you so you could throw me off my own land. Find your horse and ride." He struggled to push himself up, his face paling with the effort, his hand instinctively going to his wounded shoulder. "That's not what I'm here for now," he said, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Everything's different." "Is it?" she countered, her eyes blazing. "Or are you just waiting until you're strong enough to do the job you were sent to do? You're Corbin's man. That's all I need to know." She turned her back on him, staring into the fire, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She had let the world in, and the world had betrayed her. He was her enemy. He had been from the moment he fell at her well, and her own foolish hands had healed him, strengthened him for the task of her own undoing. The silence in the room was no longer a space of connection. It was a chasm of distrust, wide and deep and impossible to cross. They existed in a state of armed truce for the next few days. She tended to his wound as she had before, but her touch was now brisk, impersonal. She left his food by his side without a word, her movements stiff with anger and hurt. He did not try to speak to her again about Corbin, sensing the futility of it. He spent his time resting, his face turned toward the wall, the silence from his corner of the room a heavy, tangible thing. The quiet of the cabin, once a comfort to her, now felt suffocating, charged with unspoken accusations. He was gaining strength quickly. He could stand on his own now, could walk the few paces to the door and back. His steps unsteady but determined. She watched him from the corner of her eye, a cold dread growing within her. Every sign of his recovery was a step closer to the confrontation she knew was inevitable. Soon he would be well enough to ride, and then he would have to make a choice. And she believed she already knew what a man like him, a man in the employ of someone like Corbin, would choose. It was late afternoon on the fourth day when she heard the horses. It was more than one this time, their hoofbeats purposeful, coming up the trail at a steady trot. She froze, a dishcloth in her hand. Silas heard them too. He pushed himself up from the pallet, his expression grim. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not the arrogance of an enforcer, but a flash of something that looked like apology. He moved to the door, his hand resting on the frame as he peered out. "It's them," he said, his voice low. "Corbin's men. 2 of them." He turned back to face her, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. "Stay back. Let me handle this." She didn't move, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it, the moment of reckoning. The 2 riders pulled up in front of the cabin, their horses kicking up clouds of dust. They were rough-looking men, their faces hard, their eyes cold and appraising as they took in the small homestead. One of them, a thick-set man with a drooping mustache, dismounted. "Silas," he barked, his voice carrying an edge of impatience. "Corbin's been waiting on a report. Figured we'd find you warming your feet at the squatter's fire." His gaze flickered past Silas to where she stood in the shadows of the cabin, a look of contemptuous dismissal on his face. "What's the delay? This should have been done days ago. Corbin wants her gone." Silas didn't move from the doorway. He blocked their view of her, a solid, unyielding presence. "There was some trouble," he said, his voice calm, betraying none of the weakness he surely felt. "Rustlers. Up in the pass." The second rider, a younger, leaner man, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "We heard you lost your partner and got yourself shot for your trouble. Corbin ain't pleased. Says you're losing your edge." The first man, the one called Jed, took a step closer. "So you get this done now, or we do. Corbin's orders. He wants the woman and her things off this creek by sundown." He looked pointedly at Alara again. "Doesn't matter how." The threat was plain, brutal, and hung in the air like the smell of gun smoke. Alara felt a tremor of fear, but it was quickly replaced by a stubborn resolve. This was her home. She would not be driven from it. She watched Silas, waiting. Everything depended on what he did next. He was Corbin's man. His loyalty, his livelihood, was tied to the man who had just sent an eviction notice by way of these two thugs. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the tight clench of his jaw. He was a man caught between his past and his present, between a debt owed and a debt incurred. Silas took a slow breath, his gray eyes moving from Jed's hostile face to the younger man's impatient one. He seemed to be measuring them, calculating odds. He was still injured, his left arm bound tight to his chest. He was no match for two armed, healthy men, and he knew it. Ilara's rifle was on the wall behind her, but by the time she reached it, it would be too late. Their fate rested entirely on the words he chose next. "The rustlers," Silas said, his voice holding a new note of command. "The ones who killed Tom. They rode east, towards the breaks. They have Corbin's prize bull with them." Jed's eyes narrowed. "How do you know that?" "Because I was there," Silas said, his voice like flint. "They left a clear trail. A man in a hurry to get this squatter business done might miss it, but a man looking to get back Corbin's bull and avenge a partner would find it." He let the words hang there, a calculated gamble. He was offering them a different prize, a more important one in the currency of Corbin's world. Avenge a man, retrieve valuable property. That was work that paid well. Forcing a lone woman off her land was just a chore. The two men exchanged a look. The younger one seemed eager, but Jed was more suspicious. "Why ain't you on that trail yourself?" he demanded. Silas gestured to his bandaged shoulder. "Because I'm half dead, you fool. But I'm not so far gone I can't tell you the trail will be cold by tomorrow. You ride now. You might catch them before they reach the river." He held Jed's gaze, his own unwavering. "You tell Corbin I'm handling this here. Tell him I'll be back when it's done. Now go get his bull." The authority in his voice was absolute. It was the voice of a man used to giving orders and having them obeyed. For a long moment, nobody moved. The afternoon sun beat down on the yard. Jed stared at Silas, then his gaze flickered to the cabin, to Alara, and back again. He was weighing his orders against Silas's report. Finally, he seemed to come to a decision. All right, Silas, he grunted, swinging back onto his horse. But if that trail is cold, or if you ain't back at the ranch in a week, Corbin's gonna have your hide. He wheeled his horse around. And we'll be back for the woman. They rode off, their departure as sudden as their arrival, leaving a cloud of dust and a ringing silence in their wake. Silas stood in the doorway for a long time, watching them go, his body slumped against the frame as the adrenaline left him. He had chosen. He had lied to his employer's men, sent them on a wild goose chase, and openly defied an order. He had placed himself squarely between her and them. He turned slowly, his face pale and etched with pain from the effort of standing so long. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "They'll be back," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The anger had drained out of her, replaced by a bewildering mix of fear and a fragile, terrifying hope. "I know," he said simply. He walked back to his pallet and sank down, his body trembling with exhaustion. He had bought them time, a week, maybe less, but in that single act of defiance, he had declared his allegiance. He was no longer Corbin's man. He was hers. That night, the chill of the mountains seemed to seep through the very logs of the cabin. The confrontation with Corbin's men had left a lingering tension in the air, a sense of borrowed time. The fire was not enough to ward it off. Silas was quiet, his energy spent. He sat propped against the wall, his gaze lost in the flames. The professional distance Ilara had so carefully rebuilt between them had been demolished by his choice in the yard. He was no longer just her patient, nor was he her enemy. He was something else entirely, something she had no name for. Late in the evening, she saw him trying to check the dressing on his wound, his movements clumsy and strained. He grunted in frustration, unable to reach the knots at his back with his one good hand. She watched him for a moment before crossing the room. "Here," she said, her voice soft. "Let me." He stilled, allowing her to kneel behind him. She carefully unwrapped the linen bandages, her fingers light and practiced. The wound was healing well, the stitches holding, the angry redness receding from the edges. Her work had been good, but as her hands moved over his skin, it was no longer a purely clinical act. She was acutely aware of the warmth of his body, the solid muscle beneath her touch, the faint scent of him, wood smoke and sweat and man. The air grew thick with a silent, unspoken current passing between them. He was still, his head bowed, his breathing slow and even. She cleaned the wound and began to apply a fresh salve. Her hands were gentle, her movements deliberate and slow. The healer in her was tending to his body, but the woman in her was aware of the profound intimacy of the moment. She was touching him not just as a patient, but as the man who had stood for her. When she was done, she began to wrap the new bandage. As her arm came around his chest to secure it, he reached up with his good hand and covered hers, pressing it against the solid wall of his torso. His touch was warm and firm. It was not a lover's caress, but something simpler and more profound, an anchor, a connection. He just held her hand there, his thumb stroking softly over her knuckles. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The silence in the cabin deepened, broken only by the crackle of the fire. "Ilara," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. He did not say anything else. He just said her name, but he packed it with all the things he could not articulate. His gratitude, his regret for the reason he'd come, the choice he had made. In that single word, she heard an entire conversation. She did not pull her hand away. She let it rest in his, feeling the steady, slow beat of his heart beneath her palm. It was the most alive sound in the world. After a long moment, she gently withdrew her hand and finished tying the bandage. She moved back to her stool by the fire, her own heart beating a strange, unsteady rhythm. He did not speak again, but the space between them had changed. It was no longer a chasm of distrust, but a quiet, shared territory. Later, when the fire burned low and the cabin grew cold, she saw him shiver in his sleep. Without thinking, she took the heavy wool blanket from her own bed and draped it over him. It was a small gesture, an act of care that went beyond a healer's duty. It was a choice, just as his had been. A quiet acceptance of the fragile, dangerous bond that had grown between them. The week he had bought them passed in a blur of shared purpose. A fragile truce blossomed into a quiet partnership. He was still weak, but he refused to be idle. He sat by the door, his hunting knife in his good hand, and methodically sharpened her axe and her hose until they held a razor edge. He taught her how to properly clean and oil her rifle, breaking it down with the easy familiarity of a man who had lived with a gun in his hand. He spoke little of the future, of Corbin, but his actions were a clear statement. He was preparing her. He was giving her the skills he possessed, arming her for the fight he knew was coming. She, in turn, fed him, tended his wound, and watched as the strength flowed back into his limbs. She found herself talking to him as she worked, telling him about the herbs she was drying, about the habits of the deer that came to the creek at dawn. The long silence of her life was being filled, and she was surprised to find it was not an unwelcome intrusion. The quiet intimacy that began the night he held her hand deepened with each passing day. It was a thing of small gestures. He would watch her braid her hair in the morning, a soft, unreadable expression on his face. She would save him the best piece of smoked venison, placing it on his plate without comment. One evening, as a storm rolled in, the wind howling around the eaves of the cabin, a sudden crash of thunder made her jump. He looked over from where he was mending a leather strap. "It's only the sky," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. The simple words soothed a fear she hadn't even realized she was feeling. They were no longer just a healer and her patient. They were two people in a small room, waiting for a different kind of storm to break. On the 6th day, he was strong enough to walk down to the creek and back without tiring. The wound was a puckered, healing scar. He stood by the well where she had found him, looking out at the valley. "He'll send more than 2 next time," he said, his back to her. "He won't let this go. To him, this isn't about the land. It's about the challenge. He can't be seen to lose." "What do we do?" she asked, the word "we" feeling both natural and momentous on her tongue. He turned to face her. The afternoon sun caught the gray in his eyes. "There's a U.S. Marshal in Prescott," he said. "A man I know. Honest for the most part. Your deed from the railroad is legal. Corbin's claim is based on an old Spanish grant that the government never recognized. But paper doesn't mean much out here unless there's a man with a badge willing to back it up." He paused. "I can ride there. I can bring him back. But it's 3 days' ride, one way. You'd be alone here." The unspoken question hung between them. Could she face what might come while he was gone? "And you?" she asked. "Corbin will be looking for you, too." "Let him," Silas said, a hard edge to his voice. "My business with him is finished. This is what's important now." He looked at her, and his meaning was clear. "You are what's important now." She met his gaze, her heart giving a painful lurch. For years she had prided herself on her self-sufficiency. on needing no one. But the thought of him riding away, of facing Corbin's men alone, filled her with a cold, desolate fear. "Go," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Go and ride fast." Months later, the late autumn sun warmed the newly built porch on the front of the cabin. The scent of pine and curing herbs hung in the crisp air. Ilara sat in a rocking chair Silas had built, her hands, for once, idle in her lap. She watched him splitting wood by the new corral, the axe rising and falling in a steady, powerful rhythm. His shirt was off, and the sun glinted on the sweat on his back. The scar on his shoulder was a pale, silvery mark against his tanned skin, a permanent reminder of how he had come into her life. He had ridden to Prescott, his arm still in a sling, and he had returned not in 6 days, but in 10. He had not come alone. The marshal, a stern, gray-bearded man named Abernathy, had ridden back with him, along with 2 deputies. They had arrived the day after Corbin and 5 of his men had shown up at her cabin. She had held them off, her rifle steady, her voice betraying none of the terror she felt. She had stood her ground on the land she had bought and paid for with her solitude. Silas and the law had arrived just as Corbin was preparing to set fire to her home. The confrontation had been tense but bloodless. Marshal Abernathy had looked at Corbin's Spanish grant and then at Ilara's railroad deed, and he had made his judgment. Corbin had blustered and threatened, but even he was not foolish enough to draw on a U.S. Marshal. He had left, his face a mask of cold fury, his threats of revenge echoing in the quiet meadow. They knew he would not forget, but the law was on their side now. The immediate danger had passed, leaving behind a hard-won peace. Silas had never left. He'd stayed, first to ensure she was safe, and then simply because there was nowhere else he wanted to be. He never spoke of love, nor did she. Their feelings were a quiet, sturdy thing, built not on pretty words, but on shared labor and mutual respect. It was in the way he mended her fence without being asked, the way she saved him the last of the coffee, the way they moved around each other in the small cabin with an easy, unspoken grace. A wagon was making its way slowly up the trail. Ilara watched it approach, a familiar knot of professional assessment tightening in her chest. A man was driving, his wife beside him, her face tight with worry. In the back of the wagon, a young boy lay on a pile of blankets, his leg unnaturally twisted. The man pulled the wagon to a stop and jumped down. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice strained. "We were told. We heard there was a healer in these mountains. My boy Daniel, his leg is broken. A fall from the hayloft." Silas stopped his work, leaning the axe against the chopping block. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his arm and walked over to stand beside her chair. He put a heavy, comforting hand on her shoulder. Ilara looked from the worried father to the boy in the wagon, then up at Silas. His gray eyes were full of a quiet pride, a deep, abiding faith in her. She had come here to be forgotten, to escape the relentless need of broken bodies. But the world had found her, and in doing so, had brought her a life she never imagined. She rose from her chair, her hands automatically going to the ties of her apron, smoothing them down. "Bring him inside," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I can help."